Disclaimer: this is a fictional dramatization created for artistic, emotional, and educational storytelling purposes. All characters and events are entirely fictional and created using AI tools. No impersonation, misrepresentation, or harm is intended. The content contains scenes of danger involving child characters. However, no real persons or minors were involved in its production. Grace's Love Stories produces scripted, AI-generated stories that promote, entertain, inspire kindness, and emotional connection. We respect our viewers and strictly adhere to YouTube's policies.
The air in the long stone corridor was colder than it should have been. A deep, cellar-chilled draft that snaked around the tapestries and stole the warmth from Tessa's skin. For months, she had lived on the stories she told herself. Stories of a burdened king, a dedicated alpha, a mate lost to the endless demands of his counsel. The bond, that silver thread that was supposed to bind their souls, had grown thin and quiet, a distant hum where a symphony once played. She'd blamed the strain of his duties, the weight of the crown. It was easier than admitting the truth that shivered in her marrow. The silence was not from his fatigue, but from his neglect. Tonight, his scent, pine and winter ozone, the scent of the wild mountains he ruled, had led her away from their shared chambers, not towards the Grand Council Hall, but deeper, into the disused guest wing, a place of dust and ghosts. The scent was a living trail, and she had followed it like a wolf on the hunt, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. And now she stood before a half-open door, the light from within spilling a pale, honeyed rectangle onto the flagstones. Inside, he was not alone. Alpha King Brennick Solway, her mate, was with another. Naira Calder, an omega from a subservient pack, her hair a fall of molten gold against the white linen sheets. They were not locked in a frantic, guilty embrace. The scene was worse, so much worse. It was calm, practiced. His hand rested on the curve of her hip, his thumb stroking lazy circles, his head pillowed on her chest. Their scents were tangled together, his sharp pine softened by her sweet, cloying fragrance of honeyed milk. It was a perfume of domesticity, of long shared hours and unapologetic intimacy. Tessa did not gasp. She did not make a sound. The instinct to scream, to tear the world apart with the rage of a wronged mate, was absent. In its place was a vast, echoing stillness. The silver thread of their bond in her chest did not snap with a searing pain. It simply withdrew. It coiled back into itself, leaving a void that was not agonizing, but numb, cold. An amputation of the soul performed so cleanly she felt only the phantom ache of where it used to be. In that absolute, terrifying quiet, she finally understood. The meetings had been real. They had just never been about leadership. She turned before either of them could see her, her movements unnaturally silent. She drifted back through the corridors, a ghost in her own home, the chill of the stones seeping into her bones. Her feet carried her to their chambers. His chambers, she corrected herself internally. The vast room was dominated by a hearth of carved obsidian and a bed draped in heavy furs. His scent was everywhere, a constant suffocating reminder of what she had lost, of what she had never truly had. She stood in the center of the room, looking at the life she had tried so hard to build. The books she'd left by his side of the bed, the silver comb she used to brush his dark hair after he returned from a hunt, the delicate porcelain vase holding wilted winter roses, a gesture he had long since stopped noticing. Each object was a monument to a lie. The heavy oak door creaked open behind her. She didn't need to turn to know it was him. His presence was a pressure change in the air, a drop in temperature. The bond, what was left of it, gave a faint phantom twitch, a muscle memory of connection. Tessa. His voice was low, devoid of alarm or guilt. It held only a faint, weary annoyance, as if she were a minor inconvenience at the end of a long day. She turned slowly. Brennick stood there, magnificent and cruel in his power. He had pulled on his breeches, his broad chest bare, the intricate tattoos of his lineage stark against his skin. His dark hair was tousled, and the scent of Naira clung to him like a second skin. He did not look like a man caught in betrayal. He looked like a king who had been disturbed. "You should not have followed me," he said, his jaw tight. It was not an apology, it was a command. Tessa found her voice, though it felt like a stranger's, thin and brittle. The council meetings run late. His eyes, the color of a stormy sea, narrowed. He took a step into the room, his power rolling off him in palpable waves, meant to intimidate, to silence. Do not play the fool. It doesn't suit you. And what does? She whispered, the words barely audible. The dutiful barren mate? The quiet queen who warms your bed when your duties elsewhere are fulfilled? A flicker of anger crossed his face. Naira is a necessity. The pack needs an heir, Tessa. The bloodline must continue. Something you have been unable to provide. The words were stones, each one striking her with brutal precision. They had tried for 2 years. 2 years of hollow hopes and monthly mournings, of healers shaking their heads and whispering about blighted wombs. He had made her feel like a failure, a broken vessel. Now she saw it was not a shared sorrow, but a convenient excuse. So you sought a solution, she said, the numbness in her chest protecting her from the full force of the blow. I did what was necessary for the continuation of my line. For the strength of this pack, he stated, as if discussing crop rotations or border patrols. This changes nothing between us. You are the queen. That is your place, her place. A title, a position, a gilded cage where she was expected to sit silently and watch him build a life with another woman. She looked at him, truly looked at him, for the first time in months. The man she had loved, the alpha she had bound herself to, was gone. In his place stood a stranger, a king who saw her not as his other half, but as a political asset with a single glaring flaw. No, she said, the word a small, solid thing in the cavernous room. Brennick's brows drew together. No? That is not my place. She walked towards the large wardrobe, her movements deliberate. She pulled open the heavy doors, revealing gowns of velvet and silk, cloaks trimmed with ermine, jewels that glittered like captive stars. The uniform of a queen. She ignored them all, reaching instead for the simple woolen traveling cloak tucked in the back, the one she'd worn when she first arrived here as a hopeful bride. He watched her, a mixture of disbelief and irritation on his face. What are you doing? Withdrawing, she said, fastening the cloak at her throat. The rough wool was a comfort against her skin, just like the bond. His eyes widened almost imperceptibly, the first genuine crack in his composure. He could feel it then. The silence where her presence used to be, the cold void where her love had once warmed him. You cannot leave, he said, his voice dropping into the low, commanding growl of an alpha. It was a sound that made lesser wolves cower, a vibration that shook the very bones. You are my mate. You are bound to me, to this pack. Tessa met his gaze, and for the first time, she felt no answering submission, no instinct to yield. The numb space in her chest was a shield. The bond is a thread, Brennick, not a chain. It requires two to hold it. You let go of your end long ago. She walked past him, heading for the door. He reached out, his hand clamping down on her arm, his grip like iron. The touch sent no spark, no warmth, only a jarring sense of violation. Think of the sandal, he hissed, his face close to hers. The weakness it will show. An alpha king whose own mate abandons him. I will not allow it. You allowed Nira into your bed, she replied, her voice remaining impossibly calm. You allowed your pack to believe I was a failure. You have already shown them your weakness. It is your honor that is stained, not mine. With a strength she didn't know she possessed, she pulled her arm from his grasp. She did not look back as she walked out of the chamber, leaving him standing amidst the opulent symbols of their shared life. She walked through the silent palace, her soft boots making no sound on the stone. The guards at the main gate watched her pass, their faces impassive, assuming their queen was taking a late-night walk. None dared to stop her. The cold night air was a shock, but a welcome one. It was clean, sharp, and free of the suffocating scent of betrayal. The moon was a sliver of bone in the ink-black sky, offering little light. She headed not for the road, but for the trees, for the ancient, brooding forest that bordered the kingdom to the north, the ashen waste, a place of superstition and fear, rumored to be home to exiles, rogues, and things far older and wilder than their pack. She reached the edge of the territory. the line marked by ancient carved stones that hummed with faint ancestral magic. This was the border of her world, the end of everything she had ever known. To step past it was to become packless, an exile, a lone wolf, a fate often worse than death. She paused, her hand resting on the cold, moss-covered stone. She could hear the pack now, a great howl rising from the valley below, led by the powerful, familiar voice of her mate. It was the call for unity, the sound that had once made her heart swell with belonging. Tonight, it sounded like the bars of a cage slamming shut. It was not a call home. It was a demand for her return, a threat. A frigid wind swept down from the northern peaks, cutting through her cloak. It carried a scent she had never encountered before, not of pine or earth, but of something else entirely. It was the scent of deep winter, of cold iron, of ancient stone, and something primal, something fiercely, dangerously alive. It was a scent that did not belong to Brennick's world. It was a scent of beasts and kings, who were one and the same, of a power that was raw and untamed. It terrified her, yet deep within the hollow space in her chest, something stirred. A flicker of resonance, a strange, inexplicable pull toward the very danger everyone had always warned her against. The howl behind her rose in pitch, now laced with anger and command. Brennick was hunting her. Tessa took a deep breath of the iron-tinged air, the cold burning her lungs. She looked back one last time at the glittering lights of the palace, a beautiful, hollow shell. Then she turned her face to the darkness, to the terrifying and unknown scent on the wind, and took a step across the border. The moment Tessa crossed the threshold of the ashen waste, the world changed. The air grew thick and heavy, smelling of damp earth and centuries of decay. The trees were different here, ancient gnarled oaks and black-barked pines that grew too close together, their branches twisted like the arthritic fingers of old men, clawing at her cloak and snagging in her hair. The familiar sounds of the night, the chirr of crickets, the distant call of a nightjar, fell away into an oppressive, watchful silence. It was a silence that listened. Behind her, the howls of Brennick's pack warriors echoed, sharp and clear in the cold air. They were hunting, not searching for a lost queen, but hunting a fugitive. The distinction was a blade twisting in the hollow space where her bond had been. The bond, its absence was a physical malady. Her senses, usually sharp enough to pick out the rustle of a mouse in the undergrowth 100 yards away, were muted and dull. The world felt muffled, seen through a pane of frosted glass. Her inner wolf, the primal core of her being, was a silent, shivering ghost within her, cut off from the pack, from her alpha, from the very magic that made her who she was. She was less than a whole person, a shadow of a shifter. Panic, cold and sharp, began to prick at the edges of her numbness. This was a fool's choice. She had traded a gilded cage for a certain death. To be packless was to be nothing, and to be a packless omega in the ashen waste was a death sentence whispered in nurseries to frighten unruly pups. She stumbled over a gnarled root, her ankle twisting painfully. She caught herself on the rough bark of a pine, splinters digging into her palm. Her breath came in ragged, burning gasps. "Faster," she whispered to herself, the sound swallowed by the suffocating quiet. Brennick's scent, pine and fury, was a poison on the wind, growing stronger. He was closing the distance. He was a king, an alpha of alphas, his strength and speed legendary. She was an omega, her stamina no match for his, especially now, weakened and cut adrift. She pictured him running, not as the mate who had once whispered promises against her skin, but as a predator, his powerful form moving effortlessly through the darkness, his eyes fixed on his quarry, on her. She pushed herself onward, deeper into the suffocating woods. The ground sloped downward, becoming slick with damp moss and loose scree. She slid more than she ran, grabbing at ferns and saplings to slow her descent. The howls behind her grew more frantic, edged with the frustration she recognized. They were nearing the heart of the forest, the territory where even the boldest warriors of her old pack would not tread. Then the air shifted again. The temperature plummeted, a sudden, unnatural drop that left frost crystallizing on her cloak. And the scent, that strange, terrifying scent from the border returned, 100 times stronger. It was the smell of a winter that never ended, of forged iron cooled in snow, of blood spilled on ancient stone. It was a scent of raw, untamed power, so potent it made the air taste metallic, It saturated everything, eclipsing Brennick's familiar pine, scrubbing his presence from the world. And with the arrival of that scent, the sounds of pursuit stopped. Abruptly, Tessa scrambled behind a massive fallen log, her heart hammering against her ribs. She strained her ears, listening. There was nothing. No snapping twigs, no heavy panting, no angry howls. The pack warriors had halted. She could just faintly catch their scent, a confusing mix of fury, duty, and something else, a deep, instinctual fear. They were at an invisible line, unwilling or unable to cross. Their alpha's command to retrieve her was at war with a more primal terror, and terror was winning. She realized with a jolt that she had not escaped Brennick. She had simply run from his territory into another's. Slowly, she pushed herself to her feet. The woods here were even darker, the canopy so thick that the sliver of moon was completely obscured. She was in a new kingdom now, ruled by the beast whose scent clung to every leaf and stone. She moved forward, her earlier panic replaced by a chilling sense of dread. The silence was absolute. No animal life stirred. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. She broke through a final line of skeletal thorn bushes and stumbled into a clearing. It was a perfect circle, unnaturally so. In the center stood a single colossal oak tree, lightning blasted and dead, its bare branches reaching for the sky like blackened bones. The ground was not covered in soil or moss, but in a fine silvery white ash that seemed to shimmer with a faint internal light. It swirled around her ankles like disturbed snow, cold to the touch. This was the heart of the scent, the source of the power. It radiated from the dead tree, from the ashen ground, a palpable force that pressed in on her from all sides. It felt ancient, sorrowful, and laced with a rage so profound it seemed to have frozen the very air. She stood in the center of the clearing, turning in a slow circle. She was trapped. Behind her were Brennick's hunters, waiting for her to be driven back out. Before her was this. The lair of whatever creature was feared so deeply that an Alpha King's command held no sway. Exhaustion, bone-deep and final, washed over her. Her legs trembled, no longer able to support her. The adrenaline that had fueled her flight was gone, leaving behind only the biting cold and the gnawing ache of her twisted ankle. She had run as far as she could. There was nowhere left to go. She sank to her knees in the cold, soft ash. It was over. Let Bernice's warriors come. Let the beast of the ashen waste find her. The fight had gone out of her, leaving only the vast, echoing void in her soul. She curled into a ball, pulling her woolen cloak tightly around her, a futile gesture against the soul-deep chill. Her eyelids felt heavy as lead. The world began to blur at the edges, the ominous skeletal tree dissolving into a smudge of black against a gray sky. Just as consciousness began to slip away, a shadow fell over her. It was vast, blotting out what little light filtered through the canopy. It hadn't approached. It had simply appeared. The scent of winter and iron became overwhelming, a physical presence that stole the air from her lungs. She tried to lift her head to see the face of her doom, but her muscles would not obey. Through her lashes, she saw a pair of immense, fur-clad boots planted in the ash beside her. She felt the weight of a gaze on her, heavy and intense, a gaze that seemed to peel back the layers of her skin and look directly at the broken thing cowering in her soul. A low sound rumbled from the shadow's chest, not a growl of aggression, but something deeper, more complex. A sound of profound, weary recognition. Then a large hand, calloused and impossibly warm, gently touched her shoulder. The contact was a shock, a spark of heat against her frozen skin. It was not the touch of a monster. It was careful. Her last coherent thought before the darkness claimed her completely was of the impossible paradox of this creature. He smelled of eternal winter, yet he felt like the first embers of a dying fire. Strong arms slid beneath her, lifting her from the cold ash as if she weighed nothing at all, and she surrendered to the black, silent tide. Tessa drifted back to consciousness slowly, as if surfacing from a deep, frozen lake. The first thing she registered was warmth, a profound, penetrating warmth that seeped into her bones, chasing away the marrow-deep chill of the ashen clearing. She was lying on something soft, layers of thick, heavy furs that smelled of cedar, smoke, and the clean scent of the wild. A fire crackled nearby, its gentle popping a comforting counterpoint to the howling wind outside. Her eyes fluttered open. She was in a cave. Not a damp, miserable hole in the rock, but a vast, dry cavern. The walls rose high into the darkness, but the space around her was an island of light and warmth, carved out by a large, well-tended fire pit. The air was rich with the scent of roasting meat and brewing herbs, a comforting aroma that made her empty stomach clench with a painful, forgotten hunger. She tried to sit up, but a wave of dizziness washed over her, and a sharp throb of pain from her ankle made her gasp. She looked down. Her foot was bare, her boot and stocking gone. Her ankle, swollen and bruised a dark purple, was wrapped in a clean bandage of linen, smeared with a fragrant dark green poultice that seemed to hum with a gentle heat of its own. Do not move. The bones are not broken, but the ligaments are torn. The voice came from the shadows beyond the firelight. It was deep, a low baritone that seemed to vibrate in the very stone of the cave. It was the same resonant rumble she had heard in the clearing, a voice that held the gravitas of mountains and the weariness of ages. She turned her head, her heart beginning a slow, heavy drumbeat against her ribs. He stepped into the light. He was immense, larger than any shifter she had ever seen, Brennick included. His shoulders were broad enough to block out half the firelight, his frame thick with the dense, powerful muscle of a true alpha predator. He was bare-chested, his skin etched with a roadmap of old scars, pale silvery lines that spoke of countless battles. One particularly vicious scar ran from his left temple, down across his eye, and disappeared into the thick, dark beard that covered his jaw. The eye itself was clouded, a milky white orb that stared into nothing, giving his face a stark, brutal asymmetry. His other eye, a startling, piercing gray, watched her with an unnervating intensity. His dark hair was long and unkempt, threaded with streaks of gray and held back from his face by a simple leather cord. He wore rugged breeches of dark hide and thick, fur-lined boots, the same she had seen in the clearing. He was the beast of the ashen waste, the source of the scent of winter and iron, and he was watching her as if he were trying to read the last pages of a book he already knew by heart. Who are you?" Tessa's voice was a dry rasp. He moved from the shadows to the fire, stoking it with a piece of iron. The firelight played across his scarred features, making him look like a warrior king carved from granite. "I am called Rorik," he said, his gaze not leaving the flames. "And this is my territory. You are a trespasser." The words were a simple statement of fact, devoid of the overt threat she might have expected. Still, a shiver of fear traced its way down her spine. "My apologies," she whispered. "I was fleeing." "I know what you were fleeing." He finally looked at her, his good eye pinning her in place. "The whelp King Solway and his pack of yapping hounds. Their stink has been tainting my borders for hours. They are still there, waiting." The casual disdain in his voice was startling. He spoke of Alpha King Brennick as if he were a minor nuisance. "They are waiting for me," she clarified, a fresh wave of despair washing over her. "Let them wait," Rorik rumbled, turning his attention to a small pot simmering over the flames. He ladled a thick, fragrant broth into a wooden bowl. "The cold will claim them before their courage returns." He crossed the space between them in 2 long strides and knelt beside the bed of furs where she lay. He was even larger up close, a mountain of a man who smelled powerfully of the wild, pine, cold stone, and that underlying scent of iron. He held the bowl out to her. "Eat," he commanded. It was not a suggestion. Her hands trembled as she took the bowl. The warmth of the wood seeped into her frigid fingers. The broth was rich with meat and wild vegetables, and the steam carried the scent of healing herbs. She took a tentative sip. The warmth spread through her chest, a stark contrast to the hollow cold that had taken up residence there. She drank more, the simple act of nourishment feeling like a resurrection. Rorik watched her, his expression unreadable. He did not speak again until she had drained the last of the broth, the warmth and sustenance starting to clear the fog from her mind. "Why did you help me?" she asked, her voice a little stronger. "You could have left me in the clearing. You could have given me to them." "Brennick Solway's mate is of no concern to me," he said, his tone flat. "But a lone she-wolf, freezing to death in my heartwood, that is an imbalance, an offense to the old ways." "The old ways?" The term was archaic. something whispered by the pack elders when they spoke of the time before organized territories and crowned alpha kings. "He has forgotten them," Rorik said, his gaze turning distant, as if looking through the cave walls and back through time. His father forgot them before him. They build their stone palaces and call themselves kings, but they have forgotten the packs. They have forgotten the scent of the earth, the language of the moon. They have forgotten what it is to be wolf. His good eye fixed on her again, sharp and appraising. "He broke his bond to you. I can feel the emptiness in you. It is a wound that festers." Tessa flinched, instinctively wrapping her arms around her middle as if to shield the raw, hollow place he had identified so easily. "How can you know that?" "This forest, it feels everything, every broken branch, every life given and taken. A broken mate bond is a scream that echoes here for a long, long time." He rose to his full, intimidating height and walked back to the fire. "You are an Omega, but you carry no scent of your own. Your wolf is silent." It was true. The absence of the bond had muted her, not just in her senses, but in her very essence. Omegas had a distinct scent, a sign of their nature, meant to soothe and nurture the pack. Hers was gone, scrubbed away, leaving her scentless and blank. It was another layer of her humiliation, of her failure. "Brennick said I was barren," she confessed, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. He took another to sire and heir. Rorik let out a short, harsh sound that might have been a laugh if it held any humor. "He is a fool. He looks for fault in the soil when the seed itself is rotten." He turned from the fire, his expression grim. "He is not strong enough to rule these mountains. His bloodline thins with every generation. They grow soft within their castle walls. They seek alliances of coin and land, instead of bonds of blood and spirit." He gestured vaguely towards the cave entrance, towards the world outside. "A hard winter is coming, she-wolf. Not just of snow and ice. A darkness stirs in the deep woods. Old things are waking, and he is not ready. His pack is weak, built on politics, not power." Tessa stared at him, trying to comprehend the scale of his words. He spoke of kings and territories, of ancient darkness and the fate of the mountain packs, with an authority that was absolute. He was no imple rogue hiding in the woods. You are an alpha," she stated, the realization dawning on her. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "I am, of the Ashen Waste, the last of my line. An alpha without a pack, a king without a kingdom." He was an exile just like her, but where she felt only weakness and fear, he radiated a power that was elemental, a strength that came not from titles or followers, but from the land itself. He was as much a part of this ancient, brooding forest as the gnarled trees and the cold stone. "Your pack?" she asked softly. A flicker of something, a deep, profound pain, crossed his scarred face, so fleeting she almost missed it. "Gone," he said, his voice dropping even lower. "Lost to the sickness. To the curse that haunts this place." He looked down at his own scarred hands. "It is why I remain, a warden in my own prison. I keep the darkness contained. The ashen clearing, the unnatural cold, the listening silence, it was all beginning to make a terrible kind of sense. The forest wasn't just his territory. It was his charge, his burden." He seemed to shake himself from his dark thoughts, his attention returning to her. "You will rest here, heal. When you are strong enough to travel, you may leave." "Leave?" The word was hollow. "To where? I am packless, branded. Brennick will not let me go, not while I live. It is a stain on his honor." "His honor is a house of cards," Rorik scoffed. "But you are right. He will hunt you." He looked at her then. A long, searching look. His gaze traveled from her face to the hollow space in her chest he seemed to see so clearly. A mate bond, even one broken by a fool, leaves an echo. A tether, he will always be able to feel which way you run. The thought was a physical violation, a ghostly chain still connecting her to the man who had betrayed her. She would never be truly free. As if sensing her despair, Rorik moved closer again. He did not touch her, but his presence was a tangible thing, a shield of warmth against the cold fear. "There are ways to sever such echoes," he said, his voice quiet. almost conspiratorial. Old ways, but they require a price. Hope, a fragile, dangerous thing, fluttered in her chest. What price? He held her gaze, his one good eye seeming to glow with the reflected firelight. A bond cannot be simply broken, it must be replaced. The implication hung in the air between them, thick and heavy. To sever her tie to Brennick, she would have to forge a new one, with him, the scarred, exiled alpha, the lonely king of a dead forest. Her heart hammered, a frantic bird trapped in her ribs. It was an impossible choice, trading one cage for another, trading a known betrayal for an unknown, terrifying future. But as she looked at him, at the raw strength and ancient sorrow in his scarred face, she realized it wasn't a cage he was offering. It was a sanctuary, a dangerous, wild, and uncertain one, but a sanctuary all the same. Here in this cave, with this broken king, she felt more seen than she had in 2 years as Brennick's queen. He saw her silence, the conflict in her eyes, and gave a slow nod of understanding. Rest now, she-wolf. The choice is yours, but know this. As long as you are under my roof, in my territory, Solway and his dogs will not touch you. I swear it on the ash of my ancestors. He turned and retreated to the far side of the cavern, settling into the shadows where he became a large, unmoving silhouette. But she could feel his gaze on her still, a watchful, protective weight. Tessa pulled the heavy furs up to her chin, the scent of cedar and smoke enveloping her. Outside, the wind howled its lonely song, but for the first time since she'd stepped into the ashen waste, she did not feel entirely alone. The choice he had laid before her was a terrifying one, but buried beneath the fear was a flicker of something she had not felt in years, the faintest ember of power, the possibility of a future that was her own. Days bled into one another in the firelit twilight of the cavern. Tessa's world shrank to the circle of warmth cast by the flames, the soft nest of furs, and the looming, silent presence of the scarred alpha. He was a creature of routine and quiet purpose. He would leave for hours at a time, melting into the shadows of the cave entrance, and return with fresh game, a rabbit, a brace of grouse, or bundles of herbs and roots gathered from the frozen forest floor. He never spoke of where he went, and she never asked. The unspoken truth was that he was patrolling his borders, a lone king guarding his desolate kingdom from the persistent threat of Brennick's warriors. She could still feel them sometimes, not with her blunted senses, but as a pressure against the edge of Rorick's territory, a malevolent patience. Sometimes, a lone howl would drift on the wind, a questioning, frustrated sound that made the hairs on her arms stand up. Each time, a low growl would rumble in Rorick's chest, a sound so deep it was more a vibration than a noise, and the howling would cease. He was a living wall between her and her past. In his presence, she found a strange rhythm. He would prepare their meals in silence, his large, scarred hands surprisingly deft, as he dressed the meat or chopped the roots. They would eat on opposite sides of the fire, the crackling flames a conversation between them. He showed her how to grind dried herbs with a stone pestle, and how to stitch a tear in his fur cloak with a needle carved from bone. They were the simple domestic tasks of a shared life, yet they were performed with a chasm of silence and unspoken questions between them. Her ankle was healing. The swelling had gone down, the dark bruising fading to a sickly yellow-green. Twice a day, Rorick would tend to it. He would approach without a word, his massive frame eclipsing the firelight. He would kneel before her, and the sheer scale of him, his raw, untamed power, would make her breath catch in her throat. Then he would gently, carefully unwrap the bandage. His touch was firm, but incredibly precise, his calloused fingers never once jarring the tender flesh. The first time he had done it, she had flinched away, the memory of Brennick's iron grip still a phantom pain on her skin. Rorick had simply paused, his hand hovering over her ankle, his one good eye meeting hers. He had waited, his stillness a question, until she gave a slight, trembling nod of assent. He had not touched her again until she was ready. That simple act of respect, of granting her a choice in even that small thing, was a more profound gesture than any jewel Brennick had ever given her. Tonight, the wind that screamed around the mouth of the cave was fiercer than usual, carrying the promise of a blizzard. Rorick had returned an hour ago. his hair and beard dusted with snow, his mood darker and more withdrawn than she had yet seen him. He had dropped a freshly killed doe near the entrance and had since been sharpening a long, wicked-looking hunting knife by the fire, the rhythmic scrape of stone on steel filling the silence. Tessa watched him, her bowl of warm stew held forgotten in her lap. The offer he had made, the choice, lay between them, a tangible weight in the air. A bond cannot be simply broken, it must be replaced. She had thought of nothing else. It was a terrifying prospect. To bind herself again so soon after the last bond had been so cruelly betrayed. To tie her fate to this grim, solitary man in his cursed forest. What would it mean, she asked. Her voice quiet but clear over the sound of the blade in the wind. Rorik stopped his work, the silence that fell feeling sudden and heavy. He looked at her, his gray eye narrowed in the flickering light. What would what mean? The replacement, the new bond. The words felt clumsy, inadequate. Would I be yours like I was his? A muscle tightened in his jaw. He set the knife and whetstone down on the rock beside him with deliberate care. No, he said, his voice a low growl. You would not be mine. That is the language of men like Solway, of owners. The bond I speak of is older than that. It is not a chain of possession. It is an anchor. He leaned forward slightly, the firelight carving deep shadows into the planes of his face. His echo inside you is a beacon. It allows him to feel you, to hunt you, to obsess over the slight to his pride. A new bond, a stronger one, would overwhelm it. It would ground you, shield you. It would tell him, in the only language his wolf will understand, that you are no longer his to claim. That you are under the protection of another alpha, my protection. And what do you get from this anchoring? She pressed, needing to understand. Why would you tie yourself to a broken, scentless omega? For the first time, she saw a flicker of raw vulnerability in his eye. The fierce alpha king of the Ashen Waste looked, for a moment, like a man bearing an unbearable weight. I am alone, he said, the admission seeming to cost him dearly. My line ends with me. The magic of this place, the curse that took my pack, it feeds on solitude. It festers in silence. To have another soul anchored here, even one. It would be a stay against the darkness, a light in a long night. He looked away from her into the dancing flames. It would not be a mate bond in the way you have known. There would be no demands, no expectations. It is a pact. Of sanctuary for you, of solace for me. The stark, painful honesty of his words struck her more deeply than any threat or command could have. He was not offering her a gilded cage, but a shared prison. He was offering to stand between her and her past, and all he asked in return was that he not have to face his future alone. He rose and came to her side of the fire. He knelt and began to unwrap the bandage on her ankle as he did every night. His nearness was overwhelming. She could feel the heat radiating from his body, smell the scent of snow and cold iron that clung to him. His movements were as gentle as ever, but tonight there was a new tension in them. As he smoothed a fresh layer of the warm poultice onto her skin, his thumb brushed against the sensitive arch of her foot. A jolt, sharp and unexpected, shot up her leg. It was not pain. It was something else. A flicker of warmth in the cold, hollow void in her chest. A ghost of a sensation, a memory of what it felt like to be connected. Her breath hitched. Rorik froze, his hand still on her foot. He looked up at her, his gray eye wide, searching her face. He had felt it too. A faint, almost imperceptible tremor along the dead thread of her inner world. Your wolf is not gone, he whispered, his voice rough with a strange emotion. She is not dead. She is sleeping, wounded, hiding from the pain. He looked into her eyes, and in that moment the firelight, the cave, the howling wind all faded away. She was looking into his gaze, and it was no longer just the eye of a scarred warrior. It was vast and deep, the color of a winter sky just before the moon rises. It held the sorrow of his lost pack, the crushing weight of his lonely duty, the fierce, untamed power of his spirit. And in its depths she saw a reflection of herself. Not the broken, barren queen, but a she-wolf, lost and afraid, but alive. Still alive. He saw her, all of her, the shame, the betrayal, the hollowness. And he was not repulsed. He was not judging. His gaze held her, steady and sure. It was a gaze that held the moon, the tides, the turning of the ancient world. The choice was no longer a choice. It was the only path forward. To remain tied by a ghostly thread to Brennick's cruelty was a slow, lingering death. To flee into the unknown world, packless and hunted, was a quick one. But this was a chance. Not for a life of ease or happiness, but for a life, a chance to heal, a chance to fight. "I will do it," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "I accept your pact." Rorik's breath drew in with a sharp hiss. The fierce intensity in his eyes sharpened, his gaze burning into her. The air in the cave grew thick, charged with a sudden, potent energy, as if the ancient stones themselves were holding their breath, waiting. He did not move, his warm, strong hand still cradling her foot, but she felt as if the entire world had just shifted on its axis. The weight of her words settled between them, sealing a fate she could not yet begin to comprehend. The pact was sealed not with words, but with a profound and resonant silence. Rorik's gaze held hers for a long moment, the world narrowing to the space between them, before he gave a slow, solemn nod. He finished tending to her ankle, his movements even more deliberate than before, as if the very air had grown heavier, more sacred. He then retreated to his side of the fire, the invisible line between their spaces in the cavern feeling both wider and more charged than ever before. "The ritual must be done at the peak of the full moon," he said, his voice a low rumble that barely carried over the storm that now raged outside. "It is in 2 nights. It is then that the veil is thin, and the old magic is strongest." Tessa simply nodded, her throat too tight to speak. 2 nights. In 2 nights she would sever the last ghostly tie to Brennick and bind herself to this place, to this man. The thought was a terrifying, exhilarating weight in her stomach. "You must be strong," he continued, his eyes fixed on the fire. "Your body and your spirit. The ritual will demand it." For the next 2 days, he became her keeper in a way he had not been before. The food he prepared was richer, infused with herbs she did not recognize that sent a deep, strengthening heat through her veins. He brewed teas that were earthy and potent, clearing the last of the fog from her mind and senses. He was no longer just a warden. He was a mentor, preparing his charge for a trial. He also began to speak, not of his past, not of the sorrow that shadowed his features, but of the forest. He spoke of the trees as if they were sentient beings, naming the black-barked pines the silent sentinels, and the gnarled oaks the old fathers. He described the paths of the deer and the hunting grounds of the hawk. He taught her the names of the winter-blooming flowers that grew only in the deepest, most sheltered parts of the woods, their petals the color of ice and blood. He was teaching her the language of his kingdom. He was showing her the soul of the ashen waste, the life that pulsed beneath its cursed, silent surface. And as she listened, a strange thing happened. She began to feel it. Faintly, at the very edge of her perception, she could feel the slow, deep heartbeat of the forest around her. It was a resonance, a thrum of ancient, sleeping power. Her own inner wolf, the silent ghost within her, stirred for the first time, not with fear or pain, but with a deep, instinctual curiosity. On the afternoon of the second day, the blizzard broke. A fragile, wintry sun cast long, blue shadows across the snow-covered landscape. Rorik declared her ankle healed enough to walk on, with care. "Come," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "You must see it before the moon rises." He wrapped her in a heavy fur cloak, the one he often wore, and its weight was a comfort. It carried his scent, winter, iron, and a faint trace of wood smoke, and she found herself breathing it in, a strange, grounding reassurance. He led her from the cave. The world outside was blindingly white, the air so cold it felt sharp in her lungs. The deep snow muffled all sound, creating a world of profound peace. He led her not back towards the ashen clearing, but deeper into the woods, along a path she had not seen. The trees here were even older, their branches heavy with snow, forming a cathedral-like canopy above them. After a short walk, they came to a place that stole her breath. It was a small, hidden amphitheater of stone, sheltered by a sheer cliff face on one side. In the center, a hot spring bubbled up from the earth, sending plumes of steam into the frigid air. The water was a startling, vivid turquoise, and the rocks around its edge were free of snow, warmed from below. Runes, ancient and weathered, were carved into the stones, symbols of power and binding that she had only ever seen in the oldest pack scrolls. "This is the Heartwood," Rorik said, his voice hushed with reverence. "The place of beginnings. The ritual will be performed here." Tessa stared at the steaming pool, at the ancient runes. This was a place of deep magic, older than any Alpha King, older than any pack boundary. It felt sacred, primal. "What must I do?" she asked, her voice a whisper. "You must enter the water. You must let go," he said, turning to face her. His expression was grim, his one good eye filled with a warning. "When the bond is forged, it will feel like fire and ice. It will seek out the echo of Solway within you and burn it away. You must not fight it. You must allow it to cleanse you. It will be painful." Her fear returned, a cold knot in her stomach. She thought of Brynix, of his betrayal, of the hollow ache that had become a part of her. The echo of him was a poison, and the thought of it being burned away, no matter the cost, was also a kind of hope. "And you?" she asked. "I will be the anchor," he said simply. "I will guide the magic. It will hold you to this place, so you are not lost in the pain." They waited as the sun sank below the horizon, painting the snow in shades of rose and violet. The cold deepened, and the first stars began to pierce the indigo sky. When the full moon crested the top of the cliffs, huge and luminously white, it bathed the clearing in an ethereal silver light. The steam from the spring glowed. The runes on the stones seemed to pulse with a faint energy. "It is time," Rorik said. Tessa's hands trembled as she unfastened the heavy cloak and let it fall to the snow. She was dressed in a simple linen shift she had worn beneath her traveling clothes. The cold air was a shock against her skin, but she forced herself to walk to the edge of the pool. The steam billowed around her, warm and inviting. She looked back at Rorik. He stood like a statue in the moonlight, his scarred face a mask of intense concentration. He gave her a single, sharp nod. Taking a deep breath, she stepped into the water. It was hotter than she expected, a deep geothermal heat that was almost scalding, but it quickly became a comforting, liquid embrace. She waded to the center of the pool, the water coming up to her shoulders. The moon was reflected on the surface, shattering into 1,000 silver shards around her. Rorik moved to the edge of the spring, kneeling on one of the carved stones. He held his hands out, palms down, just above the surface of the water. "Close your eyes," he commanded, his voice taking on a new resonance, a rhythmic, chanting quality. "Find the echo inside you, the last thread that connects you to him. Do not fear it. Look at it, know it. You must be the one to offer it up." Tessa closed her eyes. She turned her focus inward, past the fear, past the pain, into the hollow void in her chest. And there it was, not a silver thread as it had once been, but a thin, ugly, blackened strand. A dead thing still latched onto her soul. It pulsed with a faint, resentful energy, Brennec's pride, his anger, his possessiveness. "I see it," she breathed, the steam swirling around her face. "Good," Rorik's voice chanted. "Now, let it go." He plunged his hands into the water. Pain, it was absolute. A searing, white-hot agony erupted from the center of her chest, a supernova of torment. It was not the slow burn of heartbreak. It was the brutal, violent tearing of a soul. She screamed, a raw animal sound that was ripped from her throat. The blackened thread was being cauterized, burned away with a fire that felt like it was consuming her from the inside out. Her body arched in the water, every muscle seizing. She felt herself dissolving, becoming nothing but the pain, the silver moonlight, and the searing heat. Then, through the fire, came the ice. From where Rorik's hands entered the water, a wave of profound elemental cold spread through the spring. It was not the cold of winter, but the cold of the void between stars. The absolute zero of a soul that had been alone for centuries. It slammed into the fire, a cataclysmic battle inside her. She was being torn apart and frozen solid all at once. The pain was unbearable. She was losing herself, her consciousness fragmenting. Anchor, his voice echoed in her mind. Not through her ears, but directly into her soul. Hold fast. She felt a new energy flow from him, through the water, into her. It was the strength of the mountains, the ancient resilience of the stone, the deep, unshakable power of the ashen waste itself. It was him, his essence. It wrapped around her fragmented spirit, a steadying, grounding force. It did not stop the pain, but it gave her something to cling to in the storm. It was the anchor. She focused on it, on him, on the scent of winter and iron, on the memory of his gentle hands tending her ankle, on the deep sorrow and unwavering strength in his one good eye. She clung to the thought of him as the fire and ice ripped the last vestiges of Brennick's echo from her soul. And then, with a final, violent wrench, the blackened thread snapped. The release was explosive. A wave of energy erupted from her, churning the water of the spring into a frenzy. The pain vanished, replaced by a vast, silent emptiness. But this emptiness was different. It was not the cold, dead hollow of before. It was clean, pure, a blank slate. She slumped forward in the water, utterly spent, her head falling beneath the surface. Strong hands caught her before she could drown. Rorik was in the pool with her, the hot water swirling around his waist. He lifted her easily, cradling her against his broad chest. Her head rested in the curve of his neck and shoulder, her cheek against his scarred skin. His warmth, the solid living beat of his heart against her ear, was the most real thing in the universe. "It is done," he rasped. His voice strained. The ritual had taken a toll on him as well. She could feel a fine tremor running through his powerful body. She lifted her head, blinking water from her eyes. The moonlight seemed brighter, the stars sharper. The air tasted cleaner. She looked at him. In the silver light, the scar across his eye seemed less a mark of damage and more a line of character. His good eye burned with an intensity that held the reflection of the moon. A new thread was spinning itself into existence in the clean space inside her. It was not the frivolous, shining silver of her first bond. This one was different. It felt real. It was woven of deep earth and cold stone, of iron resilience and shared solitude. It was not a bond of ownership, but of alliance, a pact, an anchor. And as it settled into place, her own wolf, silent for so long, finally stirred from its slumber. It lifted its head, not in fear or submission, but in solemn, quiet acknowledgement of the alpha who had given it shelter. And for the first time, a new scent began to rise from Tessa's skin, faint but clear in the cold night air. The scent of winter jasmine, a flower that bloomed against all odds in the deepest snow, the scent of her own soul, reawakening. The world after the ritual was sharper, clearer, as if a film had been wiped from her eyes. The bond with Rorik was a quiet, steady presence within her, a low thrum of connection, like the deep, resonant note of a cello. It did not sing with the giddy, youthful infatuation her bond with Brennick once had. This was a foundation of granite, a pact of survival and mutual respect that ran deeper than any fleeting romance. It was an anchor, just as he had promised, grounding her, silencing the last, lingering whispers of her old life. Her senses, so long muted, were slowly reawakening. When Rorik left the cave now, she could feel the direction he took, a faint pull on the bond. She could smell the subtle shift in the air that heralded a coming snow, and hear the distant snap of a twig under a deer's hoof. And her own scent, the winter jasmine, grew stronger each day, a quiet declaration of her own returning identity. Her inner wolf was awake, observant and calm, watching the scarred alpha with a wary but profound respect. It recognized him not as a mate in the traditional sense, but as a true alpha, one whose power was inherent, not inherited. The change in Rorik was more subtle, but it was there. The profound loneliness that had clung to him like a shroud seemed to have lessened. There was still a deep well of sorrow in him, a grief for his lost pack that she knew might never fade, but it was no longer an all-consuming void. Sometimes, when he thought she wasn't looking, she would see him watching her, a strange, contemplative expression on his face. The pact had been for solace, a light in his long night, and in some small way she seemed to be fulfilling her part. They fell into a new routine, one of shared purpose. She was no longer a patient, a refugee. She was a partner in their shared isolation. She learned to set snares, to track game in the snow, to identify the edible roots and barks that sustain them. Her body grew stronger, leaner, the soft edges of her life as a pampered queen replaced by the hard-earned resilience of a survivor. One afternoon, a week after the ritual, Rorik returned to the cave, not with game, but with a grim set to his jaw. The pressure at the edge of his territory, the one she had almost grown used to, had changed. "Solway grows impatient," he said, his voice a low growl. "He has sent a new party. They are probing the borders, testing the wards. They carry silver." Tessa's blood ran cold. Silver. Not the metal of jewelers, but the bane of their kind. A weapon used not for hunting, but for war, for extermination. Brennick was no longer just trying to reclaim his queen. He was preparing to invade. To punish the rogue who had sheltered her. "What will you do?" she asked, her own voice tight with fear. "I will remind him why his father and his father's father taught their pups to fear the ashen waste," Rorik said, his good eye glinting like polished steel. He went to a dark alcove at the back of the cave, a place she had never seen him approach. He pulled aside a heavy hide curtain, revealing a chamber carved from the rock. Inside, hanging on the wall, was a set of ancient, formidable armor, plates of blackened steel, etched with the same runes she'd seen at the hot spring. And leaning beside it was a weapon that made her gasp. It was a massive battle axe, its twin heads forged of dark, gleaming metal that seemed to drink the light. "This curse," he said, his hand resting on the axe's haft. "It took my pack, but it left me their strength. It is a debt I carry." He turned to her, his face a mask of grim resolve. "Stay in the cave. Bar the entrance. Do not leave until I return." He donned the armor piece by piece. It fit him as if it were a second skin. With the axe in his hand and the scarred, blackened armor covering his massive frame, he was no longer a reclusive exile. He was a figure from legend, a wraith of war and vengeance. He looked at her one last time, a silent command and a flicker of something else, a protective reassurance, passing between them along the new forged bond. Then he was gone, a phantom of iron and fury melting into the snow-dusted forest. Tessa did as he commanded. She rolled the great heavy stone they used to block the entrance at night into place, plunging the cavern into near total darkness, save for the flickering fire. And then she waited. The hours that followed were the longest of her life. The bond was a taut wire in her chest. She could feel his presence moving through the forest, a cold, focused rage. She could feel the proximity of Brennick's warriors, their sense of familiar but now sickening miasma of arrogance and aggression. And she could feel the moment the two forces met. There was no great clash of armies. Through the bond, she felt a surge of Rorik's power, a wave of cold, terrifying energy that seemed to emanate from the very earth of the ashen waste. It was not the heat of a typical alpha's rage, but the bone-deep chill of an ancient curse, the fury of a winter that never ended. She heard no screams, but she felt the panic, the terror, the visceral flight of Brennick's pack. It was over in minutes, a rout, a complete and utter humiliation. She felt Rorik's slow, deliberate return. He was uninjured, but the bond carried the echoes of his cold fury, and beneath it, a profound, soul-deep weariness. When he rolled the stone away from the entrance, he was no longer wearing the armor, but the weight of it still seemed to be upon his shoulders. He said nothing, simply went to the fire, and sank down onto the stone ledge, staring into the flames. "They're gone?" she asked softly. "For now," he rumbled. "They will not be so bold again, but he will not give up. This has gone beyond you, she-wolf. It is about his pride. He cannot abide a challenge to his power, especially not from an exile he believed was long dead." "Dead?" she whispered. Rorik finally looked at her, the firelight catching the milky white of his blind eye. "The sickness that took my pack, the curse. It was believed to have taken me as well. For 10 years, the packs of these mountains have thought the line of the ashen waste alphas was extinguished, that this forest was empty, haunted only by ghosts." He gave a bitter, humorless smile. They were half right. The revelation settled on her with a chilling weight. Rorik was a ghost, a legend, a forgotten king, and she, by binding herself to him, had dragged him back into the world of pack politics and war. Brennick hadn't just lost a mate. He'd discovered a rival he never knew existed. a rival who had just single-handedly terrified and routed his best warriors without taking a scratch. "He will come himself," Tessa said, the certainty of it a cold stone in her gut. "He will not send others again. He will have to answer this challenge himself." "I know," Rorik said, his gaze returning to the fire. "Let him come." The confrontation came 3 days later. The moon was a waning crescent, and a heavy fog had settled over the forest, muffling all sound. But they did not need sound. They felt his approach through the territory, a single powerful presence burning with incandescent rage. "He is alone," Rorik said, standing and moving towards the cave entrance. This time, he did not take his armor. He took nothing but the power that was in his blood and bones. "Do not face him," Tessa pleaded, rushing to his side. "There is no need. You have proven your strength." "This is not about proof," Rorik said, his voice grim. He placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch firm and grounding. "This is about endings. That black thread inside you is gone, but the story is not finished. He will never stop hunting you, haunting you, until the source of his obsession is dealt with. Stay here," but she could not. "No," she said, her voice shaking but resolute. "I will not hide while you fight a battle that began with me. I will stand with you." A flicker of surprise, and something akin to pride, showed in his good eye. He gave a sharp nod. "Then stand behind me." They met him in the ashen clearing. The fog swirled around their knees, the great lightning-blasted oak a skeletal sentinel in the gloom. Brennick stood on the far side of the clearing, a figure of contained fury. He was dressed for battle, in gleaming steel and dark leather. His handsome face was twisted into a mask of pure hatred, his eyes the color of a stormy sea, fixed on Rorik. "So the ghost of the Ashen Waste lives," Brennick snarled, his voice cutting through the mist. "Hiding in the shadows, stealing what is not his." "She was never yours to own," Rorik replied, his voice a low, calm rumble that was somehow more intimidating than Brennick's rage. "You discarded her. You broke the bond. She is under my protection now." Brennick's gaze flicked to Tessa, standing just behind Rorik's broad shoulder. His eyes widened slightly as he took in her scent. The winter jasmine, the clear, undeniable scent of a wolf reawakened. And then he must have felt it, the absolute, total absence of her in the space where their bond had once been. There was no echo, no phantom limb, just nothing. The reality of it, the finality, seemed to enrage him more than anything else. "You dare?" he roared, his form beginning to shimmer and distort. "You dare anchor yourself to this relic? This walking corpse?" He shifted. With a sound of tearing cloth and snapping bone, he exploded into his wolf form. He was a massive beast, a king of wolves, his fur the color of dark pine, his teeth bared in a terrifying snarl. But as large as he was dwarfed by what happened next. Rorik did not move. He simply closed his eyes and drew a deep breath. The ground beneath their feet seemed to tremble. The unnatural cold of the clearing intensified, and the silver ash began to swirl, rising into the air like a ghostly whirlwind. Rorik's body grew, not with the violent speed of a normal shift, but with the inexorable, terrifying force of a mountain rising from the earth. His bones lengthened and thickened, his skin split to reveal a pelt not of fur, but of shadows and ice, the color of a moonless winter night. When he opened his eyes, they were both glowing with a chilling silver light. He was a dire wolf, a beast from the age of myths, larger and more powerful than any shifter Tessa had ever imagined. The curse had not just left him his pack's strength. It had concentrated it, transforming him into something primal, something terrifyingly beautiful. Brennitz, in his own formidable wolf form, hesitated. For the first time, a flicker of fear, of shocked disbelief, showed in his eyes. He had come expecting to fight a rogue alpha. He had found a god of winter, but his pride, his rage, was too great. With a deafening roar, he launched himself across the clearing. The clash was not of flesh and bone. It was of elemental forces. Brennick was a storm of furious, living muscle, a maelstrom of claws and teeth driven by a king's wounded pride. He was all hot rage, the scent of pine and ozone burning in the foggy air. He slammed into Rorik with the force of a battering ram, aiming to crush, to dominate, to break. Rorik was the mountain. He did not yield. He was ancient stone and glacial ice. an embodiment of the unyielding, patient fury of the ashen waste itself. He met Brennick's charge not with matching frenzy, but with implacable, rooted strength. The impact shook the very ground, the sound a sickening crunch that echoed through the silent, fog-shrouded trees. They were locked together, a whirlwind of dark pine and deeper shadow, a savage tableau in the center of the ashen clearing. Tessa watched, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. The bond to Rorik was a live wire inside her, a conduit for the cold, focused power he wielded. She could feel the battle not just with her eyes, but in her soul. She felt the searing heat of Brennick's hatred, a desperate, possessive fire that sought to consume everything it touched. And she felt Rorik's response, a vast, deep cold, not of malice, but of absolute final judgment. It was the cold that came for all things in the end, the frost that broke the strongest stone. Brennick tore and ripped, his claws seeking purchase, his jaws snapping for a killing hold on Rorik's throat. But Rorik's form was like fighting a blizzard. His shadowy pelt seemed to shift and writhe, offering no solid grip. Brennick's claws scraped against something harder than hide, a substance that seemed to be forged of ice and shadow, and his teeth met only the chilling, unyielding cold. Rorik, in contrast, moved with a brutal, terrifying economy. He was not interested in a display of dominance. This was an execution. He weathered Brennick's initial, furious assault, absorbing the blows as a cliff face absorbs the crashing of waves. Then, with a movement too fast for Tessa's eyes to truly follow, he countered. He did not slash with his claws. He drove his immense weight forward, using his shoulder to slam Brennick sideways. The Alpha King, for all his power, was thrown off his feet, crashing into the trunk of a dead pine with a sound of splintering wood and a pained yelp. Brennick was on his feet in an instant, snarling, but there was a new element in his rage, a thread of disbelief, of dawning terror. He had never been physically bested. He had never met a force he could not overwhelm. He looked at the dire wolf before him, at the glowing silver eyes that held no heat, no passion, only the cold, clear light of a winter moon, and he finally understood. He was not fighting an alpha. He was fighting the forest itself. He lunged again, this time with a desperate feint, trying to get past Rorik's guard. He was fast, a dark blur of motion, but Rorik was not there. He seemed to dissolve into the swirling fog and ash, only to reform directly behind Brennick. Before the king could react, Rorik's massive jaws, filled with teeth like shards of obsidian, closed around Brennick's back leg. The scream that tore from Brennick's throat was not a wolf's howl, but the high, agonized shriek of a man. The sound of bone snapping was sickeningly loud in the preternatural quiet of the clearing. Brennick collapsed, his back leg twisted at an unnatural angle. He tried to scramble away, dragging his broken limb, his proud, kingly form reduced to a wounded, terrified animal. Rorik stood over him, a great shadow of judgment. The silver light of his eyes was merciless. He lowered his massive head, his hot breath steaming in the cold air, his teeth inches from Brennick's throat. Tessa could feel the killing intent radiating from him, a cold, clean finality. He was going to end it, to end the threat, to end the story, to erase Brennick from the world. And in that moment, something shifted in Tessa. Watching the arrogant king, the man who had shattered her heart and humiliated her, now cowering and broken, she did not feel the triumph she might have expected. She did not feel satisfaction. She felt a profound emptiness. His death would not heal her wounds. His destruction would not rebuild what he had broken. It would only tie her to another act of violence, another ending written in blood. Rorik's power was a righteous one, born of grief and duty, but if she allowed it to be used for vengeance on her behalf, she would forever be a part of that darkness. The pact she had made was for sanctuary, not for retribution. "Rorik, no!" her voice, clear and strong, cut through the tense silence. It was the first time she had ever raised it to him, the first time she had ever presumed to command. Both wolves turned their heads to look at her, Brennick with wide, terrified eyes, Rorik with a questioning silver gaze. She stepped forward, out from behind the relative safety of a gnarled oak, into the center of the clearing. The swirling ash coated the hem of her simple dress. She met Rorik's glowing eyes, her heart pounding, but her resolve firm. She reached out to him, not with her hand, but through the bond. She did not send a command. She sent a feeling, a plea. She sent him the clean, quiet peace of the cavern, the warmth of the fire, the simple solace of a shared meal. She reminded him of the pact, a light in the darkness, not a deeper shadow. Do not become the monster they believe you to be, she sent along the bond, the thought as clear as spoken words. His power is broken, his pride is shattered. Let that be his punishment. Let him live with it. She saw the conflict in his eyes, the primal urge of the wolf, the alpha, to eliminate a threat, warring with the ancient sorrow of the man who had lost everything to violence. He looked from her to the whimpering, broken form of Brennick at his feet, and a long, shuddering breath escaped him, a plume of steam in the frigid air. The killing intent receded, replaced by a deep, weary cold. He opened his jaws and stepped back. He did not shift back. He remained in his dire form, a towering figure of mythic power, but the immediate threat was gone. He looked down at Brennick and let out a low, guttural growl that was not a threat of attack, but a final, absolute declaration of dominion. It was the sound of a king banishing a lesser creature from his lands, forever. Brennick, understanding the reprieve, forced himself to his feet. Painfully, awkwardly, he began to shift back. The transition was agonizing, his broken leg contorting grotesquely. He stood before them, naked and trembling in the cold, clutching his shattered limb. The proud Alpha King was gone. In his place was just a man, defeated and humiliated, stripped of his power and his pride. His eyes, when they met Tessa's, held no anger, no hatred, only a dawning, horrified understanding of what he had thrown away, and a deep, abject fear of the power he had so arrogantly challenged. He did not speak. He simply turned and began to limp away, stumbling through the ash and into the fog-shrouded trees, a broken king retreating from a kingdom that was no longer his to contest. When the sound of his pained retreat had faded, Rorik finally began to shift. The massive mythical form dissolved, the swirling ash settling back to the ground. He stood before her as the man she knew, scarred and immense, the weariness of the battle and the weight of his curse heavy on his shoulders. He was breathing heavily, the toll of wielding such power evident. Tessa walked towards him, her steps sure and steady on the ashen ground. She stopped just before him, looking up into his face. His one good eye was fixed on her, filled with a complex storm of emotions. Gratitude, surprise, and something deeper, something warmer that she had never seen there before. "You showed him mercy," he said, his voice a rough rasp. "You taught me that a broken thing is not a worthless thing," she replied softly, her hand rising, seemingly of its own accord. She laid her palm flat against his chest, over his heart. She could feel its strong, steady beat beneath his skin. His pride was his power. You took that from him. It is a wound that will never heal. His own large, scarred hand came up to cover hers. His touch was warm, possessive, a silent acknowledgement of the truth of her words, and of the new reality that had just been forged between them in the crucible of that fight. They had not just defeated a king, they had chosen a different path, not of vengeance and death, but of sanctuary and life. The bond between them pulsed, a warm, steady light in her soul. It had been forged in a ritual of fire and ice, but it had been tempered here, in the ashen clearing, by an act of mercy. It was no longer just a pact. It was something more. As the first faint light of dawn began to pierce the fog, filtering through the skeletal branches of the great oak, Tessa looked at the scarred, lonely king of the ashen waste, and knew with an absolute certainty that resonated in the deepest part of her reawakened soul that she was finally home. 5 winters had passed over the ashen waste, 5 cycles of deep snow and silent, starlit nights. The borders of Rorik's territory were no longer tested. The story of the broken king, Brennick Solway, had spread through the mountain packs like a chilling wind. His rule, already weakened by his obsession and neglect, crumbled entirely after his defeat. His pack had fractured, his alliances dissolved. He lived now as a bitter, crippled recluse in a corner of his own diminished lands, a living monument to the price of arrogance. The fear of the ashen waste and its ghost king had been reborn, and the forest was left in peace. But inside its borders, the forest was no longer a place of absolute silence and sorrow. A quiet, resilient life was returning. In the summers, the faintest hints of green could be seen on the lower branches of the lightning-blasted oak in the ashen clearing. The curse that had held the land in its icy grip for so long was beginning to recede, its power broken not by a great battle, but by the steady, shared warmth of two souls who refused to remain broken. Tessa stood at the entrance to the cave, a heavy fur cloak wrapped around her shoulders. The air was crisp with the promise of the coming spring, and the scent of melting snow and damp earth was a welcome perfume. The cavern behind her was no longer just a sanctuary, it was a home. Furs and woven blankets softened the stone, shelves carved into the rock held clay pots of dried herbs and preserved berries, and the fire in the pit burned with a constant, cheerful warmth. The bond to Rorik was no longer a quiet thrum. It was a living, breathing symphony inside her. It was the calm certainty of his presence when he was near, the gentle pull of his direction when he was hunting, the shared, unspoken language that passed between them in a single glance. The pact had deepened, evolved, blossoming into something neither of them had dared to expect. It was a love born not of fleeting passion, but forged in the harshest of winters, a bond of profound, unshakable partnership. He was her anchor, and she, in turn, had become his. Her gaze was fixed on the Heartwood Spring, a short walk from the cave. Steam rose from its turquoise waters, mingling with the cool morning mist. Rorik was there, his back to her. He was no longer the grim, solitary warden. The deep lines of sorrow around his eyes had softened. Laughter, a low, rumbling sound she had coaxed out of him over the years, was now a familiar music in their shared life. He was teaching again, but his student was much smaller. A child, a boy of 4, with Rorik's wild, dark hair and Tessa's determined chin, sat on the edge of the rune-carved stones. His small feet, impervious to the chill, dangled just above the water. Rorik was kneeling beside him, his large, scarred finger tracing one of the ancient symbols. "This one is for strength," Rorik's deep voice carried on the still air. "The strength of the mountain." "Like you, Papa?" the boy asked, his voice bright with childish awe as he looked up at his father's immense form. Rorik's rumbling laugh echoed in the clearing. "Yes, Bram, like me." He then pointed to another rune. "And this one is for heart. The courage to bloom in the snow, like your mother." The boy Bram turned and saw her then. A wide, joyful smile split his face. "Mama!" he cried, scrambling to his feet and running towards her, his short legs pumping. Tessa knelt and caught him in a fierce embrace, burying her face in his hair. He smelled of pine needles, sweet milk, and the faint, clean scent of the hot spring. He was the impossible truth, the living embodiment of their healing. The healers of Brennick's pack had called her barren, a blighted womb. They had been wrong. It was not her that was broken, but the world she had lived in. Here, in the heart of the wild magic, anchored to a true alpha whose strength was in his soul, not just his bloodline, she had healed. Her body, like the land, had reawakened. Bram was the proof. Rorik walked towards them, his long strides eating up the ground. He knelt beside them, his presence a shield of warmth against the morning chill. He placed a hand on Bram's back and looked at Tessa, his one good eye filled with a love so deep and powerful, it still sometimes stole her breath. "He has your spirit," Rorik said, his voice soft. "He argues with the squirrels." Tessa laughed, the sound clear and free. "He has your stubbornness. He tried to teach a rock to swim yesterday." They stayed like that for a long moment, a family framed against the backdrop of the ancient, healing forest. The last ghosts of their past had long since faded, replaced by the vibrant, demanding reality of the present. Later that day, Tessa walked alone to the ashen clearing. She carried a small leather pouch. She knelt in the center, where she had once collapsed in despair, and opened the pouch. Inside were seeds, tiny and dark. Seeds for the winter jasmine vine, the flower whose scent was her own. With her bare hands, she dug into the silvery ash. Beneath the surface, there was no longer just cold, sterile dust. There was earth, dark, rich, and alive. She planted the seeds in the soil, patting the ash back over them. It was an act of faith, a promise to the future. As she stood, Rorik came to stand beside her, his hand finding hers, their fingers lacing together. He looked down at the spot where she had planted the seeds, then at her, his gaze filled with understanding. "Do you think they will grow?" she asked, a whisper on the wind. He squeezed her hand, his thumb stroking the back of her knuckles. "Here," he said, his voice a low, certain rumble as his gaze swept over the forest, over her, over the life they had built from the ashes. "In this place, everything grows." They stood together, silent and content, watching the sun climb higher in the sky. The forest was no longer a prison, but a kingdom reborn. Not through conquest or politics, but through the quiet, resilient strength of a bond forged in fire and frost, and the enduring promise of new life, blooming against all odds where the wild mountain meets the sky.